As we are now rolling into the fourth year of war between Russia and Ukraine, the world is watching very carefully to see what's going on between, first of all, the United States and Ukraine to try to come up with some kind of an agreement upon what they're going to negotiate with Russia. And then now, even as we speak, U.S. representatives are on their way to Moscow to take those messages to Russia and to Vladimir Putin to see what he's going to agree to. A lot of people have been saying a lot of things of late, and we're going to get into a lot of that to try to figure out just exactly where are we? Are we any closer to actually ending the war? And is there a possibility that the United States could hand off to Europe and that Europe may be the one to pick up the heavy load and to see if they can either continue the war with Ukraine or with Russia, or if they would themselves will reach a negotiated settlement? A lot of more moving parts here, very much unsettled as to what's going to happen right now. And to try to make some sense of it, we have Matthew Hoback, one of our favorite guests, former State Department official, former combat Marine, good friend and friend of the show. Matt, welcome back.
Hey, Danny, good to see you.
Well, listen, this thing has, there's been a lot of moving parts here of late, so a lot to discuss. Obviously, in the current zone here, we had the big explosion in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky. A lot of the fallout that happened after that, a lot of glad handing and backslapping when Zelensky went to Europe afterwards. And, they were all this thumbs up, but then they're kind of like, yeah, but not much more than a thumb. I'm not sure how much more stuff we're going to give you because they're saying we're still relying on the United States. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Ukraine got back together again in Riyadh of late, and they said they agreed to, which surprised a lot of people because Zelensky was going in saying, I'm only going to agree to an air and sky ceasefire, but that's all. And he said he also wants a bunch of other stuff. They want freedom to do whatever they want. They want the possibility of joining NATO. They want a strong national defense, etc., all of which are antithetical to everything the Russians have been saying. But then he comes out of that meeting and he completely changed his tune. He said, okay, no, actually a 30-day total ceasefire is cool with us. And then Steve Witkoff went off to Moscow to try to see if he can get the other side onto this. Yeah. First of all, I wonder if you could just kind of comment on this dizzying activity that's been going on here and just where you see that leaves the men who were actually fighting on the ground.
Sure, Danny. Essentially, this shows, excuse me, what we've been saying for years now, that to end this war, it's just a question of the willingness of the Americans and the Europeans to do so. And it's important to note that this war did not have to even begin. It didn't need to take place, except the Americans and the Europeans dismissed and totally denied any possibility for not even negotiations, but dialogue prior to Russia's invasion in February 2022. But that also, too, at various points during this war, negotiations could have been carried out. Of course, people are familiar with the early attempts at negotiations immediately after the start of the war, immediately after the invasion, that would have resulted in hundreds of thousands of lives being spared and likely no territorial concessions by Ukraine. And now here we are 3 years later, where hundreds of thousands have been killed and wounded, vast areas of Ukraine destroyed, parts of Russia destroyed, and the reality that Russia is winning, that the Ukrainians no longer have the backing of the United States the way they did under the Biden administration. And so what you just described there, in the sense of Zelensky doing some about faces, is the reality that he cannot continue this war without the American support. And so he's willing to accept whatever's being offered now. And the whole great shame of it, of course, is, as I said, that the loss of hundreds of thousands of men, 10,000 civilians as well, for something that could have been diplomatically resolved more than 3 years ago.
And, I wonder to what extent Zelensky has really done an about face and acknowledge what's actually going on, because after he left the Oval Office, he didn't come out, as, what's the word I'm looking for, contrite, and said, okay, well, they read me the riot act. I see what we have to do here. Instead, he went on to Europe and saying, hey, we need all this support. And he got new packages promised by the UK, Keir Starmer said, we're going to give you guys more this year than in any other year of the war that we have so far, which is really saying something. Lots of others in Europe were saying a bunch of stuff. And then they started giving some mixed signals. The Europeans did that, well, we still need the U.S. backstop before we're going on. But that didn't stop them from moving into saying, hey, there's a 30-nation coalition of the willing that they're trying to foster right now to get a muscular peace enforcing mission. We'll talk about that more in just a second. But here's another big one here by Ursula von der Leyen a few days ago, talking about a Rearm Europe plan.
This is a watershed moment for Europe. And Ukraine, as part of our European family, it's also a watershed moment for Ukraine. Europe faces a clear and present danger, and therefore Europe has to be able to protect itself, to defend itself, as we have to put Ukraine in a position to protect itself and to push for a lasting and just peace. We want a peace through strength. And this is the reason why I present today to the leaders the Rearm Europe plan. The Rearm Europe plan provides up to 800 billion euros for defense investment. It gives the member states possibility to invest in the Ukrainian defense industry or to procure military capabilities that go right away to Ukraine. So it is to the benefit of rearming Europe, rearming the European Union, but also arming Ukraine in its existential fight for its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Okay, I'm gonna peel out a number of things from there, but first of all, I just want to look at like the strategic, the 30,000-foot level. What does Europe think is going to be the message heard in Moscow that they're on an $800 billion rearm program?
Well, what Moscow is going to hear is that this zone in Eastern Europe is never going to be demilitarized, that Moscow will have to garrison the parts of Eastern Ukraine that it will annex. It will have to fortify Kaliningrad further, and it will have to maintain an army much larger than it had prior to 2022. And that while once this war is over, Moscow will not be spending, the Russians will not be spending a third of their federal budget on its military, but it will be spending 10 or 15% of its budget on its military. So essentially, what Russia has to take from this, these threats, these drums of war, the saber rattling, this ain't over until we say it's over, or that this is just the first iteration of the war, essentially is what you're hearing from the Europeans. Well, the Russians have to take that seriously, and they have to prepare then for a future war with a EU army, an EU army, of course, something that's long been fantasized about by elements within Europe. And certainly you see now, Ursula von der Leyen being the prime example of various individuals as well as institutions in Europe not hedging for the conclusion of this war, but jockeying for a position to take advantage of it. So certainly what will come from, say this ceasefire is agreed to, turns into a permanent ceasefire, Russia gets what it wants in terms of territorial annexation, and there's things on paper about NATO and Ukrainian NATO membership for Ukraine, neutrality for Ukraine, etc. Well, the way I believe mainly Europe will see was this is just our opportunity, as von der Leyen was saying, or as was said, by Francois Hollande, Angela Merkel, Petro Poroshenko, the leaders of France, Germany, and Ukraine, when the Minsk II agreement was signed in 2015. What they came later to say, this is just a delaying tactic, an opportunity for us to arm Ukraine, to prepare it for war with Russia. Well, I think that's how many in Europe will see it, and the Russians will be forced to view it as whatever ceasefire comes about, it will not be a permanent and total ceasefire, and it will just be a rearming period to prepare for the next iteration of this war.
And so if that's how Moscow is viewing it, then that would imply that far from creating peace through strength, which von der Leyen specified there, it's going to be building future insecurity and increasing the risk for war for everybody. I mean, is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, because I don't see the argument being put forth by Europe fully being one of deterrence. It's going to be more about retaking Ukraine. It may not be that bold of a statement as I just said, but certainly that will be what the implication is that retaking the Donbass, reestablishing Ukrainian sovereignty, reestablishing Ukrainian independence, however it wants to be phrased, that will be the driving motivation for this rearming of Europe. And that's what many will be looking forward to, the opportunity to take back Europe from the Russians, because it would then fall into that trope, that old trope as well, that Russia is not part of Europe, that they're Oriental, that they're Eastern, that they are not a part of Europe, either as part of the actual continental landmass or as part of the cultural society norms of the continent. And so I see this configuration in terms of the rhetoric already appearing, but then certainly we can look back historically and see other examples of that, where the need to, again, take back Ukraine will be a motivating call throughout Europe for it to arm and for the creation of this type of EU army. And it will be not as boldly stated as I just said it, but I think that will certainly be there. And of course, the public relations, the propaganda will be about deterrence. But I think for many in Europe, it will be about going to war with Russia to retake Ukraine.
You know, I don't know for sure what the Europeans is that they haven't been, as you said, as direct and bold as that. Those the implications are. But what we do know for a certain is that we showed on our channel here earlier this week a comment by a member of Ukrainian Parliament on Fox News. I think it was on either Saturday or Sunday last week, where he said, you know, our objectives in getting this war over are to not actually give away the territory. We'll temporarily cede it to Russia, but with the we won't acknowledge it, and with the expectation that through diplomacy in the future, they'll take it back, so that they're claiming that. So they're already saying with their mouths that whatever we agree to here, the point is we're planning on coming back. Now, the Russian side, when they hear that, they have history, and they think about things that you just mentioned. They think about the Minsk issue. They think about, because they mentioned this late, the Istanbul thing in February 20 or April 2022, etc. They're thinking about those things already. So if they're hearing that on the eve of when you want to get into negotiations on an end of war settlement, then it seems like that they're going to have a lot less motivation to agree to something that's quick and easy. If it doesn't include some pretty draconian conditions that they would agree to.
Right, and that seems to be what the Russians are saying. I mean, Vladimir Putin held a press conference today with Lukashenko from Belarus, and in it, he said that he is in general agreement with the 30-day truce as long as it leads to a permanent truce, which includes certain guarantees. Right. So among those, of course, the things they've always said or have been saying for years now, no Ukrainian membership of NATO, neutralized Ukraine, essentially a demilitarized Ukraine, and international recognition of the territorial expansion of Russia, the 4 oblasts in the east, as well as Crimea. And you can tell in that the way he speaks, he's basically saying, Danny, what you're saying there as well, is that we need to have some guarantees that the Europeans or Ukrainians or the Americans or whoever won't restart this war. You see that the Russians really do want this thing to be finalized. This, of course, completely flies in the face of the talking points, the propaganda, the rhetoric we've heard the last several years about how this is just the first step in Putin and Russia's eventual conquest of all of Europe. You know, that's complete nonsense. In 3 years of war, Russia has barely been able to take 10% of Ukraine. You know, you add in Crimea and they're up to 19% or 20%. And the idea that they're going to conquer all of continental Europe and cross the channel and take the, do what Hitler couldn't do. I mean, that's the type of that's the fear mongering we've come accustomed to in the last several years.
Matt, I want to show you something. This graphic about the capability. A lot of people like to look at things on paper, and they say, okay, when you look at the Russian side and the NATO side all put together, not that one, Gary. Well, I actually have that one handy, Gary. I'm looking for the one you had that showed that planes and the tanks and all that kind of stuff. When you look at the balance of power between the two, on paper, it looks like it does favor NATO. Right. Here it comes right here. There's this graphic down here where it shows the armored fighting vehicles. The blue there is for Europe. The red is for Russia. And you see that there's like, it says 32,700. If you can't read those little numbers, that's the armored fighting vehicles that Europe has, as opposed to 10,700 for the Russian side. And then self-propelled artillery, combat planes, all of which are in the advantage of the European side. So on the paper, it looks like, you know what, there's something there that the Russians should be afraid. But then, Gary, put that second one up there. When you look at the number of personnel in the forces, you see the biggest one is Poland at 202,000. France has 200,000, and then it just goes down from there. And let's see, where is Germany's on there? 181. But even that on paper, say for example, the UK, which is 184,000. When you look at the actual ground combat capacity, they have one armored division, which, according to recent press in the UK, is not fit for war. They couldn't fight today if they had to. So when you look at the actual capacity and manpower, Russia's way over the top. So if you add all those up together, they don't include as much as Russia has in Ukraine alone, let alone in their entire army. So however many planes and tanks and artillery pieces you may have, that is not what you need to fight a war. You need trained manpower. And I just don't think that Europe has it.
No, they don't. They don't, and certainly their stocks are all low. And more importantly, and I was able to skim through that article, but you know, the author shows a pretty amateur take on all of this. You know, again, just comparing things on paper. Well, they've got more of this, they got more of that, so of course they'll win. When doesn't take into consideration the factors you were taking into consideration, the factors that how quickly the European countries went through their war stocks, how in addition their capability to rearm, their capability to replenish is negligible. And what's missing in that article, in this comparison about a war between Russia and NATO, well, one, they're assuming that Turkey would take part on the NATO side, which I don't know anyone who'd say that would happen. Right. But I mean, so you take out the second largest army out of NATO, the one with probably the best combat capability after the Americans, the Turks, remove them from the equation, as well as
take Hungary out, take Slovakia out.
Take Hungary out as well. Exactly. I mean, so it's much more complicated than the article wants to lay it out. But the two most important factors to me, economic strength and political will. The Russians have a massive superiority in that. Right. I mean, not in the sense of their defense industrial base, what they've shown themselves capable of these last few years, whatever criticisms you may have of the Russian military, plenty to go around. You cannot criticize their ability economically to have support for their forces in this war, as well as sustain other industries and keep their economy afloat, and in many cases running well. Yeah, they've got high inflation, they've got high interest rates. Things aren't great. The Russians themselves will say things aren't great. But if you compare the industrial capacity, the economic capacity of Russia to Europe, it's no comparison if you were to talk about what would happen in full-scale war. Who be able to?
And it was interesting. The categories they chose to put on there with airplanes, tanks, and artillery pieces or armored vehicles, because that gives an advantage to NATO. They didn't look at drone capacity. They didn't look at missile capacity.
Right.
Now the new Oreshniks, et cetera. And they didn't look at the manpower pool itself, which is way out of character. So the things that are really making an impact on the war today, they didn't talk about the things on the NATO that is inferior to that, on top of everything that you just mentioned with the geography and the willingness of various countries. I mean, Hungary's right there in the middle, and they're not going to participate. They've said so categorically. They certainly wouldn't go to war with Russia. They want to avoid the thing. They want to get it over with. So there's a lot of holes in that. But yet, here's Zelensky, who seems to really still want to go down that path.
So the question today is, can Ukraine win this war or hold off Russia without continued U.S. support?
It will be difficult for us. That's why I'm here. That's why we speak about the future negotiations. It will be difficult without your support, but we can't lose our values, our people. We can't lose our freedom.
Yeah, he said we can't. I'm not sure that's graphic with words and correction, English languages. That's actually the right word. You don't want to give up those. I get it, but that you can't implies that you have the power to enforce that. And as you just talked about here, militarily, they most assuredly don't have the capacity to enforce that. But yet he seems to want to go down that path and said, yeah, it'll be hard without the U.S. help. But we can do it because he also knows he had a lot of the European support by the time he made that comment.
Yeah, and we'll see in the next year or two, Danny, how sincere the Europeans really are about this. Certainly, if they start to build out an EU army and they start to make it so they're not dependent upon the Americans to fight, because right now, you could explain it better than I could, but certainly these European nations can't go to war without the United States. There's just too much interoperability, as it was called, too much dependence upon the United States to provide key factors, key elements of war fighting that the Europeans simply don't have. So in this rearming that you hear about, coming from the Van der Leyen, but also from the Germans, from the French, from the British, that's going to be part of it, is making themselves independent militarily from the United States. If you start to see that, then you start to believe that this is serious. And I don't think anyone in Europe is talking about picking up the war with Russia in April. That, the United States exits its support from the war and the Europeans are going to send troops then into. No, I think they've got it's a 5-year or a 10-year vision. And that the belief, this optimism, is that in 5 or 10 years, we'll have these revitalized fighting forces that are
Yeah. But see, that leads me back to an issue. Going back to von der Leyen there, I mean, she's talking about this $800 billion package, and yet the stuff that they're talking about is years into the future. Right. I think some of the stuff from UK is specifically on there. I think it was, I can't remember the nomenclature, but it was air defense missiles that they had, a 1.8 billion pound deal. But that was actually something that would be fulfilled beginning in like 2027 through 2030. Ergo, right, long after Ukraine has lost the ability to fight. So the stuff von der Leyen's talking about, she said, and we want to help Ukraine fight. With what? Because the time frame is now. They're falling apart now. Trump's trying to negotiate an end right now. So what are they even talking about?
Yeah, so I think the idea being is that they grudgingly accept this ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, truce, whatever it's called, again, with this idea that in 2035, they'll only be in a position to take back Ukraine. And for 10 years, they can politic off of it, right? They can fearmonger, they can moralize, they can use this for their own political benefits. Certain people like Van der Leyen, Gary and I talked about this last week, Van der Leyen, you could see in that video, you see in her mind, in her soul, this idea that, yes, and I will be the first European Union leader to have my own army. Right. So the ego that comes into this, both for individuals and institutions, as well as for Europeans who view, yes, the American empire is going away. The hegemon is retreating. The multipolar world is already here. And what needs to happen is Europe needs to unite so that we can be as much as a player in the multipolar world as the United States, Russia, and China, that going forward in this world, there will be 4 powers and Europe will be one of them. And this is our destiny, right? We can get all, metaphysical with it if you want, but that's how some of these people see, both like on a philosophical level, but also on a personal interest, institutional interest, where they can benefit. Now, the great danger, right, Danny, is that, okay, they've got this vision. It's going to take us 10 years to get to the point where we have an European army that can fight without the Americans and that can duke it out and fight and defeat the Russians. What happens in that 10-year time? And we've already seen the Russians launch one preventive war, right? They launch this war in Ukraine in 2022 because they feel that they need to carry out this war because they don't want to have to fight a war in the future, right? That's their justification. That's the way they talk about it. So we've already seen them do that once. And so if the Russians know that this is what the European aim is, what makes anyone think that the Russians wouldn't do something to try and preclude that? right?
And look, I mean, you
work.
just got to say, look, I mean, look at it where it is right now. We're trying to get to some kind of negotiated end, but because Russia is on a wartime economy, they're on a wartime defense industrial base. It's not full on yet. It's still limited with. That's why they call it a special military operation as opposed to a general war, because that would imply another higher level of both mobilization as well as transition from the wartime of a peacetime economy to a full-on wartime economy, which they still haven't done. But now that all the pieces are in place, whereas, as you just mentioned, none of that is done in Western Europe at all. So if the Russians were to say, I think that that's where the Europeans are going in 5 or 10 years from now, why would they wait until the Europeans have built all that stuff up when they have it right now? And if there's ever advantage, it's right now if they ever wanted to try that. So I don't want to give Russia any motivation to do something that would be counterproductive, but we seem to be trying to provide them with that.
That's exactly right. And the most base reasons for these exist in terms of why Europe is doing it. If you look at Stormer, Macron, Merz in Germany, the realization that the political dynamics in their country have shifted and they're not going back, right? So what do they need then to counter the economic distress, the societal distress, the pressure in their countries? Well, we need a foreign enemy. I mean, this is as old as time. I mean, this goes back. I'm sure the Sumerians utilized this, right? In our earliest civilization, blame the outsider, blame a foreign enemy to distract your people or try and unite them, right? As opposed to them focusing on how crappy of a government you are. I mean, so I think there's that as well. Just the base domestic political instincts here that, look, it's served. The British have been utilizing the Russian bear as their great adversary, as the great danger for almost 200 years now. It's worked before. Why not keep going with it?
I guess so. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Of course, that's not something you should want to be fixed. But it's interesting though, because I think that in order for all this to happen, the European side, if not needs, certainly wants to have a figure in between that can keep the thing stirred up. And of course, that's the role that's being played very effectively by Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yep.
And so he has not been willing to have a negotiated settlement. You mentioned earlier in the show about many times he had diplomatic off-ramps that could easily have been taken, chose not to have them. He keeps pushing back on peace right now. And David Sachs, who we've had on our show a few times, and is actually now, I think, something like the one of the technology czars in the Trump administration. He addressed this the other day about his concerns that Zelensky may have an incentive not to reach a deal.
I think that Zelensky has powerful motivations not to make peace. I don't think he really wants to make peace. He says that the war needs to keep going on. He basically says the war needs to go on forever. And I think there's good reasons for that in his mind. Number one, if the war is over, he loses power, right? He canceled elections there. He's in the 6th year of a 5-year term. If he stands for elections, he's very unpopular there, despite what the fake polls from USAID say. And he'll be vulnerable to political retaliation from his political opponents. He needs this war to justify his rules. So I think that's number one, is if he gives up power, his own safety is at risk. Number two is the gravy train here. I mean, we've been sending hundreds of billions of dollars over to Ukraine, and these Ukrainian elites there, these oligarchs, have been feasting on that money, and Zelensky's at the top of that pyramid. And that whole grift ends if the war ends. And I just think that gives him a powerful incentive to want to keep this whole thing going. Why would he end it when he and his cronies are profiting so much from this war?
And it's sad. I mean, that he put that in the term that at the very end there, like a rhetorical question, but it's not a rhetorical question. The reason why he wouldn't is because his people are dying. His people are dying to support this fiction that there's some way to turn this thing around. But I think David's overall comments are an accurate reflection of what we see.
Right. So the writing's on the wall, I think, for Zelensky in several ways. And what we began this conversation with in terms of his, turnarounds and saying, now I certainly will agree with a 30-day total ceasefire as the Americans are advising. I think it's a duplicitous. His idea is that he does what he can to hold on to power now. Right. And the lifeline will come from the Europeans. And that's what will keep him in power. I think he'll be able to justify not having elections if he wants to do so. by saying, look, we've got a 20% of our country is occupied. We can't hold elections. I still have martial law in place. I mean, so he'll find ways to keep himself in power if need be. But this is why you've seen from the Russian side, as well as from some others, this argument that elections have to be a part of any type of peace deal. The gravy train that Sachs spoke of, absolutely. And that's back in September. That's why I think you and I had this conversation where we spoke about when Zelensky came to the U.S., the UN General Assembly. What he needs to go is he needs to go and meet with not just the leadership of Lockheed and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, but also the leadership of BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and others, in the sense that, look, tens and tens of billions of dollars in contracts are up if I fall out of power. I mean, the amount of money, there we go, right? Exactly. Thanks, Gary, right? The amount of money, the tens and tens of billions of dollars that these people have already under contract for future delivery of weapons and munitions and other systems, other things to Ukraine is massive. And if Zelensky comes out of power, if there's some type of peace deal that comes about that brings about Ukrainian neutrality, these guys ain't getting their money. I mean, and I would say the same for BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. BlackRock, of course, people will note, already has made a deal to, quote, rebuild, unquote, Ukraine. I actually almost said Afghanistan there. I mean, the parallels here are all right. I mean,
see where you would make that mistake.
And this is a danger, though. Actually, this is a good segue to talk about Afghanistan, because what happens, Danny, when Joe Biden comes into office, everyone expects him to say, nope, this deal that Trump made with the Taliban, we're not going to honor it. We're going to stay in Afghanistan. That's certainly what the Americans, the diplomats and the generals and the intel people were telling the Afghans. Don't worry about this. We're not leaving. That's why the Afghan government doesn't do anything to negotiate, doesn't do anything to prepare for the American departure, because they're told by the Americans, we're not leaving. Once Trump's out, don't worry about it. Biden's going to rip it up. Biden comes in and says, no, we're getting out. And then the great panic ensues. Right. And as what Sachs brought up, as you brought up, the corruption. So it's basically a patronage network. You've got a pyramid here. And those at the top take from all these hundreds of billions that are coming in. And then they pass down the rest of it. And in the next tranche, next echelon, they take their cut. Right. And it gets passed down. And the system works. But when there's a fear that maybe this money isn't going to be coming any longer, well, a panic sets in. And those at the top stop passing down what they were passing down before, and they keep everything. And that's what happens in Afghanistan in the winter of 2021, because we're hearing reports of Afghan troops, Afghan police not getting paid, not getting ammunition, not getting food, as within weeks of Joe Biden saying we're pulling the troops out, right? That panic begins and that starts to collapse. And this is essentially what, could happen in Ukraine as well. And one thing I've said for, the last few years is one of the biggest dangers would be this type of collapse, this type of panic that would cause essentially a bank run, if you will, but would be much larger than that and would bring down the government, bring down the economy, cause 5 or 10 million more refugees in Europe, and essentially end Ukraine as a state. And now you've got a failed state. And now you've got an Afghanistan or a Syria in Eastern Europe. And, that among many worst outcomes of this war, the idea of having an Afghanistan or a Syria in Europe is one of those. And so that's something I think that everyone has to be careful here. And I know the Russians are concerned about this, because why would the Russians want a failed state, out their front door, a back door, a side door, whichever way they view Europe now? So, I mean, this gravy train that Sachs speaks of has been critically important for keeping Ukraine afloat, not just in terms of making sure that weapons and munitions and supplies are allowing the Ukrainian army not to collapse, but also, too, to keep the Ukrainian government, the economy, the entire society from collapsing. So, the outcomes that are here, it's there are multiple paths forward on this. Some of them good, but many of them terrible. So the negotiated peace that may come, if it's exploited cynically by the Europeans or by those empowering Ukraine, could lead to a much larger future war, right? So you get a greater war out of peace efforts. or the alternative being that it everything breaks, that nothing works after this, that the negotiated peace fails, United States pulls out, Russia. I mean, you can see how all this becomes even worse. And so it is. We're in some pretty heady days here. Steve Witkoff, the American negotiator, is there in Moscow right now. Vladimir Putin has said he wants to speak to Donald Trump in the next couple of days. And I have to imagine during that phone call, they will iron out what differences they have, if they're not already ironed out by then, and that you'll see a joint Russian-American proposal for an end to this war, potentially by this time next week. And it depends upon what the Ukrainians want to do and what Zelensky thinks is his best path forward. He can't depend upon the Europeans now, right? In a sense of that them coming to his rescue and then providing an army to keep him safe. So does he go along with the peace deal and then basically expect the Europeans at some point to show up in 2035 and, resume the war?
Yeah, well, we'll see if if Zelensky does have a place in the whatever's left after this negotiated settlement. I doubt very seriously that that's going to be the case, because Russia has categorically said that they won't sign a deal to end whatever they may agree to until there is what they view as a legitimate leader who has passed through an election. So we'll see how that part. That's, I'm sure, going to be part of what Witkoff and what the President Trump is going to be talking about. A lot of big hurdles to overcome, but I really hope that you're right, that those do get ironed out within a week. That would be spectacular. If the killing could stop fast, we are huge supporters of that here at the Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and I know you are too. Anything that stops killing is a good thing. But whether that's going to lead to setting the stage for another bigger war later, or if it's going to actually address the root causes and is going to put this at rest, that remains to be seen. We certainly have our preferences on that.
Yeah,
but,
I was going to say, I think the Europeans have staked too much politically on this war to let it go. Right.
Yeah.
That is, I think, the unfortunate reality of that. Say you get a negotiated peace, we have this settlement. Part of it is Ukrainian neutrality, demilitarized Ukraine. In 2 or 3 years' time, the Europeans start trying to send weapons there. Right. And just that's how Budapest memorandum that people bring up all the time, how that was violated by everybody. And the Minsk agreement was violated, that this agreement gets violated again. Because I think that the powers in Europe feel that it's in their interest to not honor a peace agreement than it is to honor the peace agreement.
Well, yeah, as long as people are involved, that's going to remain a possibility. I certainly hope it doesn't happen, because there is a definite benefit for everybody in Europe, all the way to the Ural Mountains and all the way to the English Channel. Everyone could live in peace and prosperity if they were willing to do so. And I just pray that that's how it works out. But listen, thanks for coming on today, Matt. As always, a great pleasure. We're going to have a show on at 2:00 this afternoon where we're going to specifically look at the ceasefire issues and where are the possibilities for that. Putin, on the one hand, signals yet no, but then at some other comments, he seems to imply that door is open. So we're going to see, is that just posturing, or is there actually a possibility that we could get a ceasefire? We'll talk about that this afternoon at 2 p.m. and we'll see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.